We ready? Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu, ala rasulillah, assalamu alaikum, peace be upon all of you. So as the brother said, my name is Michael Abraham. I'm a public school teacher with Minneapolis Public Schools. People are usually a little curious about my background. So I've been teaching for 13 years. I'm a revert to Islam. Some people ask me if I'm Arab because I look Arab. I am Arab. My father was an Arab Christian, is an Arab Christian, and his grandfather immigrated to this country in the year 1912. And I accepted Islam in 2007 when I was pursuing a degree, my first degree in political science with the University of Minnesota. And I was studying the Muslim world at that time, and I learned about Islam and accepted it, alhamdulillah. And in my academic background, I actually always studied Muslims academically. First in political science, and then furthermore in education, which I joined after accepting Islam. And as the brother said, I've been a public school teacher, spent 6 years in elementary school, teaching elementary school, 7 years teaching middle and high school. And, in Minnesota, I did youth work in the Muslim community from the very beginning. And of course, I've always known that the public school system and just the place of youth, Muslim youth growing up in America, it's always had an ambivalent place for the Muslim community. Ambivalent meaning a place of mixed emotions, where on one end we want our children to succeed very much academically, and we want their socioeconomic status to improve. But then on the other hand, there's a lot of questions, a lot of concerns about what it might mean for Muslim children to assimilate into society. So I've always been aware of that ambivalence, and I studied it. And I've been a teacher for a long time, but in the year 2016, I developed a professional development training program for K through 12 educators entitled Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools. And then in the 2019-2020 school year, I wrote that training program into a book. In 6 years of doing the training, I've had over 2,000 educators do it across the country. Most of them, the largest number being in Minnesota, but also a lot in Washington, others across 15 states, some here in the Columbus area as well. And when it comes to empowering Muslim families in the public schools, like what I'm going to get into today is the place of this program and the place of this book and how it fits into the world of professional development in public education as it currently exists. And how it's something that the public education system is very much ready and open to receive. And that fact combined with the program makes this a powerful tool for exactly what the title of the program is, for empowering Muslim students and Muslim families in public schools. When you examine the dilemma of youth, Muslim youth in America, and maybe to a further extent the dilemma of Muslims in America in general, you can't divorce it from the fact that it burdens people, and especially young people, that the society itself does not know more about Islam. And the society itself needs to be educated better about Islam. It's just a known psychological phenomenon. It is very difficult for most people to go against social trends and go against the grain in society. And this creates a dilemma for young people, for young Muslim people, because they'll find themselves frequently, in Muslim youth, they do have a very strong Muslim identity, and they know it's important. And it gets told to them that it's important in many different places, the masjid and home. But then they spend so much of their time when they go to public school in environments that are controlled by non-Muslims, and what that equates to is being in environments that are controlled by people who, for all intents and purposes, are fairly ignorant about Islam. And there's maybe an extent to which that extends to the society more broadly. So what you find then is when you have a situation where you have two different people or two different groups of people, the one who knows more about the other, they will capitulate to the other's side of things. So a lot of times it's the case for Muslims that it just becomes easier and it becomes the path of least resistance for people to do things on the terms of the non-Muslim sets and on the accords that non-Muslims set. And many times we have to do that just to get by professionally and to get by with an easy life in the society. So what you find starts happening with youth often is they can become very insecure about their Muslim identity. And this isn't just my observation, it's something that's known generally to people. It is also known in the field of education research. There are case studies of Muslim students in the field of education that date back to the early 1980s and go up until today. Almost all of them identify this exact phenomenon that I'm talking about. It's a struggle for Muslim students to exist in public schools and to really be externally Muslim when everyone in the school, or the vast majority of people in the school, and just the way the environment of the school is set up and the educational and professional expectations of the setup is done with ignorance of Islam. Because there's so many things that people can't consider, and there's so many positions and perspectives that really can't be set up to be articulated very well when the teacher, the principal, and everyone is ignorant of the perspectives that we might have as Muslims and people who believe in Islam. Bismillah. Now, as far as educating the society further about Islam, I feel this is something that's like, it's a bit of a struggle for Muslims, and it's something that Muslims more broadly we're like a little stuck in. And it's like, how do you do it? You know, there's efforts made on social media, but social media has very limited reach because of algorithms. You know, most people who consume social media, they're in an echo chamber. So you can have tons of people talking about whatever issue concerning Islam and all this on social media, but it's not reaching many people who are already aware of this type of thing. You know, and we hold open houses, you can invite people to the masjid, all this type of stuff. That also has limited reach for educating people about Islam. And, you know, amongst non-Muslims, who learns about Islam in the society? It's people who have a self-interest in doing it. What does a self-interest usually mean? It usually means that, one, they were curious about religion. Maybe they're pursuing the truth about religion, so they went exploring religions, and then they learned about Islam, and inshallah, if they're sincere in that, they accept Islam. Might be that they hate Islam, or they have some vengeance against Islam, so they're pursuing knowledge of it and learning about it to do something against it. But the reality is, in American society, the amount of people who have a personal self-interest in learning about Islam is very, very limited. It's a small number of people. But public school educators are the class of people in the society that have a professional interest in learning about Islam. Why? Because they teach so many Muslim kids. And as Muslims, we're a young population of people. The average age of an American is 39. The average age of a Muslim worldwide is 23. And I've broken down the demographics from immigration statistics further in my book. There's not much reason to believe that it's any older here in the United States. I know from talking to educators around the country, public school educators in communities where Muslims have a presence, public school educators, they feel that presence more than other people in the society in general. Because for however many adults we have in the community, there's 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 kids in addition to that, in addition to those adults. You know, I think here in Hilliard, it's 20% of the kids in the public school districts are Muslim, or at least they took Eid off last year, is what the district cited to me. You know, I don't think 20% of the people in Hilliard are Muslim, but 20% of the school district is. In the Twin Cities, we're seeing the same thing. There's some elementary schools, they're 50% Muslim kids. So this creates a really strong incentive for public school educators to learn about Islam. Why? Because number one, they know it's important to the families and to the kids. As much anxiety and worry as we have about the kids and the way they act and how they show up, public school teachers can see that the religious identity is important to them. Number two is going with some things I'm about to show you concerning the field, and it's just something you know as a teacher. The better you know the child you're teaching, and the better you know about their cultural background, the better equipped you are to learn about them. This is something that's found on an almost scientific level within the field of education. And there's been such a strong emphasis on this in the field of education over the past 20 years, as just about every school district in America has experienced a demographic shift, that there's a high emphasis on teachers becoming proficient in this aspect of their job, in understanding the cultural backgrounds of children and families who are different than them. And what I mean by that demographic shift, 2000 to 2010 was the highest decade of immigration in the United States, period. Certainly the highest decade of immigration for Muslim populations, but just overall. So it's not uncommon in definitely urban, but first, second, and third ring suburban school districts as well. That 20 years ago, they might have had their student population be 93, 94, 95% whites, and now it's more like 60, 70, maybe as low as 50% white. The school district I graduated from in 2002 in the suburbs of the Twin Cities, it was 94% white when I graduated there in 2002. I didn't know any other Arab kid there. Now it is 58% white. And most of that demographic change, it's been immigrants. It's been immigrants. So as the school system has seen the population of its students change, there's been a recognition that it means that new understandings have to be acquired from teachers, and you can't necessarily just teach the old curriculum or teach things as usual, because the students don't necessarily have the same background that the old way was meant for, and they certainly don't have the same background knowledge. And background knowledge is a term used often in the field of teaching. And you can't teach someone without drawing on their background knowledge. So why are public school educators ready and open to learn about Islam? And I mean learn about Islam at the interpersonal level, okay, the everyday level, but in a deep way. How does it affect someone's psychology? How does it affect someone's heart? How does it affect someone's weighing of any evaluation of what is right and wrong? And how does it affect someone's external habits? Why are they ready to look at this? Well, just to show some items, some things in education. Excuse me. This is the teacher performance evaluation rubric for the state of Ohio. Ohio has a statewide rubric for this. So you know what a rubric is. It has all these, criteria of things you're supposed to do something well. Teacher evaluation rubric has a really big place in school systems, school districts, because for a teacher, it's what your professional evaluation is based on. You'll be observed by your principal or your supervisor 3, 4, maybe 5 times a year, perhaps even more if you're a new teacher. They'll see how you teach in the classroom. They'll take this rubric and they'll look to see whether or not they see the things on this rubric. And you might also, at the end of the year, undergo a professional evaluation with your principal or supervisor or whomsoever, and it'll be based on whether or not you exhibit the things on this rubric. You pretty much can't find a school district in America anymore, certainly not in urban areas or in suburban areas, where there is not some emphasis in these rubrics on learning about student and family culture. Why? Because all of these rubrics, as they exist nowadays, they're all based on a template rubric that was put together by an academic in the year 2012 named Charlotte Danielson. It's called the SOEI rubric, the Standards of Effective Instruction rubric. So if you look at this rubric, okay, you have the area of instructional planning. And then, you have ineffective to accomplished on the right side. Well, if you zoom in on the accomplished side, you look under the domain knowledge of students, because having knowledge about your students and who you are is such a big emphasis in education. You look in on the accomplished side, it says, the teacher's instructional plan reflects consistent connections to student experiences, culture, and developmental characteristic. This explicit mention of connecting the learning to student culture. If you look in classroom environments, the domain, the environment they set up, you look under the accomplished section. There's demonstration of regard. Okay, regard meaning like reverence, giving deference to. There's demonstration of regard for student perspectives, experience, and culture. Again, this explicit mention of understanding and giving regard to student culture. You see this everywhere in education. You see it everywhere. To such an extent that most of the school districts, they will have full departments set up just to treat this matter. Usually they are called DEI departments, diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes just called equity departments. That is entirely based out of this movement in education, which really was seeded before the demographic shift that took place before the turn of the century. But this movement in education to value multiculturalism, and certainly to value racial equity, which I will get more into. Now, this is from the state of Minnesota. This is Ohio's requirements for getting relicensed. So every teacher, it's generally in a state, you get your teacher's license renewed every 5 years. You usually got to do like 150, 125 credit hours of continuing education. From what I could tell in Ohio, they don't subcategorize those, but a lot of the states, they subcategorize the areas that those continuing education credit hours need to be in. This is in Minnesota. You'll see, actually, cultural competency in Minnesota is the one that they emphasize the most. They didn't always, but nowadays they specifically mention religious diversity under that. I would like to think that doing so many of my trainings, as well as other people in the Muslim community advocating in the Twin Cities area, has had something to do with them adding that there. But there's explicit mention of this, and people will ask, well, when they say culture, do they mean religion? Yes, they do. Yes, they do. How do you know that? Because, like any other field, education bases its criteria on things on what is said on research in the field and research in academia more broadly. And I know Muslims as an area of study in academia very well. You cannot find an anthropologist, a historian, a sociologist, a political scientist, or whosoever who won't tell you that you can understand Muslim culture well without understanding the religion it is based on. Most academics who study Muslims, they will actually recommend that the first way to begin understanding a basis of Muslim culture is to study Islam. And this is the case. In this case. And actually, this whole idea of cultural competency for Western people and people in America, something that should be understood about that for many of them, the most efficient way for them to build their cultural competency in a global way, and oftentimes, they'll talk about global education, making students into global citizens, this type of thing. Many people in the West, the most efficient way that they can actually learn more about the culture of other people in the world is to learn about Islam and to learn about the types of habits and beliefs that Islam causes to emanate from people. Now, you see the different things listed here. I'm going to emphasize racial diversity because in this whole movement in education to focus on these different things, people know there's different ways to look at diversity and there's maybe different interests within diversity. From my perspective, my research, definitely my experience, there has been no higher emphasis in education than the focus on racial diversity. And racial equity trainings have been a key feature of education over the past, certainly since 2010, but even really before that. I know people are catching on kind of in the media to the term critical race theory and this type of stuff, and there's some inflammatory things in that, but racial equity trains have been around a long time in education. And I'm going to show some things from that to sort of illustrate how it's really set educators up to be very open-minded to learning about Islam. So this is a book by an academic from UCLA named Glenn Singleton. And he formed an educational consultancy group out of California called Pacific Education Group. He wrote this book in 2005 called Conversations About Race. This gentleman's training has probably been the educator training that has been done by more educators in the last 15, 16, 17 years since he wrote the book than any other, I would say. They've since taken off other websites the list of all the districts who've done it, but just about every major urban school district did this man's training, as well as almost all of the first and second ring suburban school districts. A couple weeks ago, I was having a conversation with Hillary Sloat, who is the director of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion department here in Hilliard. She referenced Glenn Singleton's work to me as if it would just be matter of fact that I would know about it, because in education, it is almost matter of fact that you know about it because it's so commonly done. Now, what was the core of his training? It's about what this book says. Okay, Courageous Conversations About Race. Sometimes his training's called that. The other is, it's called Beyond Diversity. Beyond Diversity. And both these terms, the use of the term beyond, as well as the talk about conversations and having conversations, this is actually spread to the broader society now, especially after the killing of George Floyd and the focus on race that brought to the society more generally. But all of that was seeded by so many people in public education having done this training or trainings that were based off of it or emanated from it. So the main thing that Glenn Singleton gives in his training, he has school districts adopt a protocol about how you have a conversation about race with someone, and then he encourages staff members to have conversations about race with one another, and oftentimes as well to have conversations about race in the classroom with students as well. And what you see on the screen here, this is his protocol. I'm not going to read through the whole thing about how to have a conversation about race. It consists of having 4 things you agree to with the person or group you're having the conversation about race about, and 6 conditions that you're going to abide by. Now, within this, you can kind of, I'll talk a little bit about my experience with this. And actually, my first 2 days in public education in the United States was spent doing this man's training with the school district I was working for at the time. I went to his national conference in 2015. I've talked to many people who worked for his group and were trainers. And overall, the impact of this training, from my perspective, has been good. It's been good for what I'll illustrate here. But like anything else, when you look at something as a Muslim, you look at something with Islam as your criteria for evaluating something, you will see a mix of good and bad in it, because that's generally how we will relate to anything that is brought up in any type of a theoretical or ideological framework as it comes in the West. If you look at the second condition on the right, Glenn Singleton, he would say that you have to agree that you're going to isolate race in your conversation. Now, what that means is you have to agree that the conversation is only going to be about race. And his theory behind that, he actually had a sound theory behind that, which was that because race is such an uncomfortable thing for people to talk about, especially white people, if you don't make this agreement at the outset of the conversation, then inevitably the conversation, it won't end up being about race. It'll end up veering off into talking about some other identity marker, maybe gender, maybe socioeconomic status, or something like this. Now, me, when I would be in these trainings and in these conversations, I would say to people that I have a little bit of a problem with that condition because as a Muslim, my views on race are informed by my religion. And you can't tell me at the outset of a conversation about anything that I have to suppress my religion because that informs whatever topic I'm going to talk about, and certainly if I'm going to talk about race. Now, Glenn Singleton, for his part, I will say he was not an anti-religious guy. He actually talks about how the removal of God from the schools has really hurt black kids. He talks about that very explicitly. And he also even says directly in his book, this doesn't mean that conversations about other identity markers, such as religion, shouldn't be had, just you have to have a space for each of this or that. Okay? But the really good thing that the pervasiveness of this training has done, and almost every public educator's exposure to it, if not directly through Glenn Singleton's consultancy group itself, at least through the impact that this book and his work has had on education, and it's very, very much affected the teacher schools, the teacher training programs in the universities. If you look under the third agreement on the left side, he would tell people before the conversation had to happen, you had to expect to experience discomfort. Why? Because again, race is a sensitive topic, so it's not easy to talk about. So you have to kind of preset with people that before you have this conversation about race, you have to know it's going to feel a little uncomfortable so that you don't just duck out of it when you start to feel uncomfortable about the conversation. Now, this is where I've experienced a lot of benefit as a Muslim in public education, and certainly in suggesting and offering to educators across the country that they read a book and do a training where they're explicitly going to be talked to for a long time about religion, and specifically about Islam and what it means and all this type of stuff. Because this culture in education has actually conditioned educators to be looking for things where if the topic's a little sensitive, it's okay. And if some cultural differences or religious differences are brought up, it's okay. And also very explicit within these types of trainings is the idea of making teachers aware that when you're dealing with someone who's from a different race, ethnicity, or religion from you, you might unintentionally do something that offends them, or you might unintentionally do something that you shouldn't do or wouldn't be disrespectful or wouldn't be respectful. And even if you do that unintentionally, you should learn about those things, and you should learn what comes up with them. So the people who do my training, people who have done this training, I've found them to be the most open-minded people to doing my own training. And again, that's most educators. There's an example of the presence of this, of the jargon of Glenn Singleton. So Hilliard Public Schools right now, they're in the second year of a 3-year strategic plan for their EDI department, for their Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion department. If you look under their professional development plan for over the 3 years, the first 2 action steps that they list, it has to do with getting teachers and getting administrators to have meaningful conversations and group discussions about, they don't specify what it is, which leaves room for people to assert what those discussions will be like. But they have this explicit mention about conversations. This all emanates from Glenn Singleton's work and from its pervasiveness in education. You might also notice, too, in his protocol, if you look at the second agreement, he says, speak your truth. That's a phrasing that has caught on in the rest of society now. Like you'll see people on social media talking about speaking your truth. And some of these trainings, too, because, the professional world is downstream from the education system. So the pervasiveness of this in education, over a generation, has created it where a lot of times people are experiencing these things in the workplace. And Glenn Singleton himself, he's moved on to consulting with corporate America now, Amazon and Microsoft. Okay, I'm going to show a specific thing from another book that's been very popular in education that shows one of these conversations taking place, but also kind of the awkward position that it can put Muslims in, and the uneven position it can put a Muslim in when that non-Muslim educator doesn't have a foundational understanding about Islam. So this book was published in 2014. It's called Waking Up White. It was written by an educator from Cambridge, Massachusetts, named Deborah Irving. And it's a racial equity book, and it's based on this woman's experience of being an educator in Cambridge while it was going through this demographic shift and, becoming aware of her white privilege. It's not a bad book to read, especially for white women, I would say. But there's an anecdote in it that's useful to see for what it illustrates. Now, again, it's about racial awareness. But what fueled the demographic shift in Cambridge, as she describes it, is the influx of Ethiopian, Somalian, and Haitian families. Of course, Ethiopian and certainly Somali families, they're primarily Muslim. Now, the dilemma that she describes coming up was, it was part of the school districts, or at least the elementary school that she was working at. Excuse me. It was part of one of their traditions that so they would have a big Halloween parade every single year. And this was, something like she did when she was a kid in the school district. I can remember doing that type of thing when I was a kid in the 90s growing up. And so, it was a really valued tradition at the school. But as these new families started coming in, they were all opting their kids out of it. And they were all saying to the school they didn't want their kids to be a part of it. Now, this puts, these well-intended educators in kind of a conundrum because they feel like, they want everything to be inclusive. So the question they start asking themselves is, well, how do we make this event be able to include everybody but still keep it at the school and that type of thing? So she describes how they formed this family connections meeting and they invited these parents to come in and talk to them. And then they put the parents on the spot to ask them, tell us, why won't you send your kid to the Halloween parade? Why is the Halloween parade so bad for you? Now you see the highlighted part at the bottom, what the one mother says, she says, one woman shook her head and looked at the ceiling and she said, it's so complicated. Now Deborah Irving doesn't mention this explicitly in the book because the book is not focused on religion, it's focused on race. But you just know that this woman was a Muslim mother, most likely a Somali mother. And oftentimes, just in the society in general, this is the situation that we're in as Muslims. Really the opportunity to maybe educate people about Islam, about our religious needs, about our religious and moral preferences, it only comes up when there's some sort of conflict taking place. And then people want to know, explain, explain. We don't want this conflict to be there. It might be a interpersonal conflict, like not wanting to go to the Halloween parade or the Christmas party or the happy hour at work or this type of thing. Might be a much larger thing. Maybe the Middle East is in the news for this or that or whatever reason, and then your neighbor, your colleague, they want to know. We're always in these situations. Where,
I have spoken to many of you over the phone before you came today. I wanted to give a quick introduction about what this program is about.
Comes up. And now, there's some reason for that. It's part of polite society in America nowadays that you don't really proactively bring up religion to people. And that is not an entirely bad thing. That is something that spares people sensitivities and spares discomfort from people and this type of thing. It's not like a totally bad ethic. But it is something that is really disadvantaging us as Muslims.
Our kids and it's grating against us. And it's grating against the youth very much.
Because the youth, even more so than adults, if they go to public school, they are spending all days in these relationships with non-Muslims, and they feel the internal pressure themselves to be Muslim, and it's important in Islam and all this type of stuff. But for all intents and purposes, they're really being asked to do something very, very difficult if you're always trying to do that in an environment where it's controlled by people who are ignorant.
The goal would be that the families have good quality communication between each other, that you you're setting up
So I'm going to get into
like maybe once a month
in a moment
or once
a little
week,
bit about just my
and that
training.
you are contacting each other
What makes
to
it different.
follow up on appointments.
And,
so this can't,
really,
for this to be successful,
I've been bringing it to educators directly.
on a Muslim, like a Muslim representative calling and saying,
For
hey,
6-7
remember,
years now,
you have to meet at this
I've gotten a really good response. I just reach out to schools directly.
Kind of keeping
I
tabs
just email
on things,
teachers
because
directly. I hold
we
an event, I
unfortunately are
invite
not
them to it.
large enough
Ask them
to
to come,
do that.
So
So
schools
we would
invite
really
me,
like
just do
to
it directly,
see the families establish
Communicating with the
quality
school is not
communication.
complicated.
If you're
You just
signing up your
contact
child
someone.
for a summer
And the
event
contact
or a
information is
weekend
there.
activity, that
Emailing
perhaps you would
people in
consider
education
the
is like the
Muslim, your
easiest thing to
Muslim
do. Go
buddy
to the
or
school
the
website,
opposite,
go to the district
and
website.
then you
You'll
can
find
kind
people's
of
emails.
naturally
It's not
come
hard.
up with something where you guys can do things together.
What I'm trying to
There's
do
no
now and
pressure
doing
today
something like
about
this,
people
and
pairing up.
and,
This is just
and
a
I got on
fun
social
event.
media 2
Everybody
years. I'm
comes
trying
and
to
just
make
does,
Muslims
has a good
understand
time,
that
and it's our
this environment and
opportunity to see
education
what families
and
were
the tools I've
interested
tried to develop,
in this program.
they really are
So
strong
I'm going
tools
to
for
hand
doing
off
this
the
type of
mic
education.
to our lovely young brother,
And number
Marzouk,
one, showing
who,
our young people
joined this
that
group
we're
with Rayhan,
being
and they have been working
proactive
together since
about teaching
October.
the non-Muslims they
and
are
he
around
has
and who are
a
controlling
beautiful
their
story to share.
environments.
So
We're being very proactive about teaching them
Assalamu
about
alaikum,
Islam
everyone.
in a deep way. And then also by extension, really,
Experience.
this is
What
the
does
way
experience even
for
mean?
Muslims
By
to
dictionary
cross the
definition,
difficult
an
bridge
experience
that
is
we
an event
have
or an occurrence
of
that leaves a
advancing the
lasting
education
impact.
about Islam and the
Hello
society
everyone,
further.
as you all know, my name is
Media
Marzouk
is not going to
Nadeem,
do it
and I'm
for
one of the
us.
first
mainstream
helpers for the
media
Muslim
won't
program.
give us the time, and it's not
So I was
the
asked
appropriate
today
format
to speak
for it.
about my
Social media
experience
is
with this
generally
program.
reactionary
And when I first heard this from my
defensive.
mom,
And
I was
again,
like,
if we hold events
where
or
do
this
I
type of
even
thing, only
begin?
self-interested people are going to
So,
come.
you know what? Let's start from the
But
beginning.
public school education
It was
is
just
where
a
the
regular,
environment is
ordinary
right,
day.
the
And one
interest
day, my mom
exists,
calls me. I'm
and we
like,
have the
oh
leverage.
my God, what did I do?
We have the leverage because
And
these
so,
school districts, they're
alhamdulillah,
dependent
everything was okay.
on
So I came downstairs and
our
came to
kids
her
being
room,
in
and she
these
started telling me
schools
about this
just to
program.
maintain.
At first, I was really
many times
intrigued,
the budgeting
but
at the
also
school
I
as
was
it
a bit
currently exists.
hesitant. I won't lie.
Now, is this a
But
scary
alhamdulillah,
thing
me saying
to
yes was the best
teach
thing
people
I could have
about
done.
Islam and about our beliefs
Not only
as
did I get
Muslims
to
in
meet
the public
Rayhan,
education
but I
system?
also
Sometimes
got to
this
make a
idea makes
wonderful
people
friend.
Very, very nervous. They assume they're going to be. It's all going to
For
be
the past couple
rejected.
weeks, me and Rayhan have been
Or,
meeting together
people are
and
gonna see it so differently,
communicating
like it
and
makes
really
them nervous.
developing a connection that's more than just,
So I just,
oh, he's my peer buddy. Oh, he's
the
someone I meet
largest
once a
study
month
has ever
or once a
done
week.
of the
No,
views
he's my
and
friend now.
values
We're like
of,
this.
Public school teachers was done by an
Now, some of you may
academic
be
at
wondering,
Louisiana
so
Tech named
what does a
Robert
regular
Slater.
day look like? I'll
And
run you
he
guys through.
analyzed the findings of a
Some days
survey
we'll
that
just
is done by
talk about life, just
University of
sit down,
Chicago
have a
every
good
other
time.
year called
Or
the
other days
National
we'll play
Opinion
chess
Survey.
and checkers.
They survey
And side
literally
note, this
hundreds
guy
of
is actually
thousands
so
of
good at
Americans on
checkers.
it's a
He
very
beats
long
me like
survey, a
half
whole
the
bunch of different
time.
issues.
It's so annoying
Robert
because I
Slater,
can't
he's
win.
given the back end
But back
data
to what
of
I
that
was
and able
saying.
to filter the results.
Usually we just do
by,
whatever feels best.
the professions
This
that
one day
people
I
have.
remember he brought in
So
his
he
homework
analyzed
and
it
we
over
did
the
that.
years of just the
And
findings
another day, I
concerning
taught him how to
public
play
school
chess.
teachers.
Although we're still working on
And
that
what
a
he
bit. we're
found
getting
is
there.
that public
Alhamdulillah.
school teachers, on
Now,
average,
after we do our little activity
they are
or whatever
more
we
socially
do for fun,
conservative
then
than
we
the
come
average
downstairs
American.
during the
And
we meet
certainly
on Sundays,
more
so we come
socially
downstairs and
conservative than
help
the
with
average
Sunday
American
school
of
lunch.
their education
We
level.
help pass
Because
out,
the dynamics
set
of
up,
America
and
are
tear
such
down
that in
all the
general,
stuff. And alhamdulillah,
the
this guy
higher
is
educational
such a
attainment
great
you have,
helper.
the more likely you are to be
Like, we have the
socially
whole
liberal.
system going down. First,
But
I
he
place down
found
the
that
plate,
that
then
was
he
not
does, I do the
fully the
tissue,
case with
then
public
pizza,
school
it goes
educators.
boom, boom,
They're
boom.
more
It's
likely to
incredible.
attend religious
And honestly,
services.
the whole experience is incredible.
They're more likely
Just
to
being
have
with him and having fun with
conservative
him.
social values, especially when
that's
it comes
not actually what I want to talk about with him.
values pertaining to
This guy is so
protection of
good at
children,
making friends.
to protection of children.
I have a
this type
couple
of
friends
thing.
in Sunday school, so
And I
they'll
wouldn't
come
bring
by,
those
I'll be like, hey,
statistics
what's up, my
if
guy?
I didn't know
And he'll-
from my
and
own
he'll be like,
experience
oh, is he your
in
friend?
talking
I'll be
to
like, yeah.
educators across
And
the
so
country,
he goes out
as well as
himself
working in the
and
school
greets
district
them
in a
and is
very,
like,
very
"Hi, my
liberal
name's
city
Rayhan.
of
What's your name?"
Minneapolis. Minneapolis is more
And just
liberal
by
than
that
this
little
place.
greeting, we've already made a friend.
That is
And
the general
just through those, I
sentiment
can
of
guarantee like
educators that
half
you
of
will
my
find.
friends are not
You'll
just
find
my
that
friends
they're very
anymore, but
open-minded
they're our
because
friends.
of this type of professional
And so to
development
end off
they have
day, we usually go to
in
Usher,
the culture of
pray
education.
Usher, and then again,
And many
we'll
of them,
talk to our friends.
the kind of moderate
Alhamdulillah, it's a
perspective
great
that Muslims
experience,
have on
and
things.
I seriously would not.
They're actually very, very much
I would not want to
open
do it
and
with anyone
wanting
else.
those perspectives to
Now,
be
my mom
brought
also asked
into the
me to give some
discussion
advice to
of
those who are a little bit
public
on
school
the edge
classrooms.
and want to do this.
How much time do we
And
have?
so what I'll say
before
to
we
them
break
is
for
just do it.
before the event?
I know you may be scared.
minutes?
I know it may be uncomfortable.
5 minutes?
But at the end
Okay,
of the
I'm
day,
gonna buzz
this is
through
all
just
we
some
have.
things because
And
to
if you
totally
don't do it
buy,
now,
I
you'll
know I'm
regret
kind
it.
of
Even I said, like I said, I was hesitant
marketing
at
my
first. I was a little bit scared
here.
and
I really will have
hesitant.
to, like,
But
get
at
the
the end
book
of the
and
day,
read it to
it
make
all
my
worked out
opinion about
great.
it.
Alhamdulillah.
This is something I really
And
put
all
into.
this made me
In
realize
trainings,
such a great blessing.
You know, it doesn't have
the
to
blessing
be
of
mine,
having
but
a friend.
the importance of having
We take for granted so much the
specified
people that are
resource
around us. And
that
realizing
explains to
that
public school educators
Rayhan is now one of
what
my
it
friends
means
is
to
one of
be
the
Muslim,
greatest feelings ever.
and then relates
These guys don't want
every
anything
aspect
big
of
or
the
grand
religion
or anything
to
special.
the
All they
their
want is
professional
someone who will
context
treat them
of
like
the
a
public
normal
schools.
human being. So
It
just
shows
do
them,
it.
number one,
Be
not
their
only how to
friend.
not
Be
clash
their
against
blessing.
that and
Because at
how
the
to
end of the
avoid
day,
making
we're all just humans,
moral
and we
dilemmas
all
for students,
sometimes just need a
but
friend.
also how you
Thank you.
utilize it. How you can utilize it in a secular fashion that's appropriate for public schools to further engage students in academics and to further
you
engage
so much,
students
Marzouk.
in better behavior in school.
All right,
The
everybody,
benefit
I
of
hope you
having
enjoy
this
your
is
dinner.
now,
Inshallah,
as a
we will be
parent,
breaking out into the
advocating,
activities,
you don't have to explain
in a few
every little
minutes,
thing
so We'll
yourself.
be calling out,
Advocating
kids to
can just become
our,
a matter
our
of referring
girls
educators
will be
to
heading
resources.
Over here for a
There might be
painting
specific things
class.
that come up that are a little more complicated
Our
than
young
that.
boys will be
But this
heading
type of
towards the kitchen,
foundational
where we'll be
teaching
doing
of the
a fun
education system
activity,
is something that
and
we
then,
have to do.
our older boys will be
And
heading over to the
African
youth
Americans,
lounge with,
they've been
Brother
able to do
Abdurrahman,
it as a group
inshallah.
because the resources existed for them. Latino people have been able to do it as a group because the resources exist for them. Same with Native Americans, same with other groups in the country. They've been able to do it because the resources existed for them for a long time.
It's on for you. Yeah.
So what I've developed here is
Marzouk,
resources that families can
said
use and
such
parents
beautiful
can
words
use
that brought tears to my
recommend
eyes. It really did.
to their teacher
But
the wants
Rayhan,
of
who's-
Muslim parents and what they want
he
for their children.
explains Rayhan
At
as
a
such
deeper-
a
deep-
great
deeper
child,
level.
but Rayhan has his moments. And the way Marzouk deals with him and the way
There's just
he
some benefits
interacts
about
with
it,
him,
okay?
I'm
And you know,
telling you, I have not
it's
seen
not that
anybody so.
zero education
Nadeem
has been
and
done
Habib,
about
you know, may Allah protect him
Islam
from
or
all
Muslims
the,
in
the
the
difficulties in
public
this
education
world that
system.
we
There's
have.
a lot of
but-
times schools that
but
have
it's
been
a
exposed as one
compliment to
thing or
you.
another. But just some things that
you know,
make
this
this,
is such a blessing for us. Because we wouldn't know
difference.
what to do with Rayhan.
And,
Because
you know,
we have a
aside
daughter
from
that
just
goes to the
depth of
school,
it, okay, it's
but we
very-
wouldn't know, and we live an hour away
aside
from
just the
here.
depth of it.
So we want to do this as
It's
a
not
family. So I
focused
encourage
on,
really everybody
co-opting any
that
other
can
type of education on
me and my wife would be
Islamophobia,
happy to host
which then focuses
a
on
weekend
bullying of Muslim kids, hate crimes
so give us
in
a
general.
chance for all those people,
Because
not sit
there's
there and
kind
just
of-
listen, because
that's kind
it's
of already been
amazing what he has done. So,
in education.
mashallah, Nadeem, jazakallah.
It just sets an agenda for if you have a Muslim child in your school and you want to totally respect their religious practice and their religious identity and partner with their parents in the shared secular objectives that the religion gives us, and you know there's all kinds of evidence in it from all types of fields about everything Islam tells us to do is healthy behavior. So if you don't respect a Muslim kid's identity as a Muslim in public school, they lose their own platform to exhibit mature and healthy behavior that every school wants them to do. It just sets an agenda for how to do that. So it's a tool where a Muslim family, a Muslim community, they can proactively educate, productively, comprehensively educate public school educators of this is what we want for our kids. You know, just the idea of reading a book or doing an extended training in a professional development type atmosphere, what does that do? Bismillah. That creates a captive audience. And this is something we need to explain Islam to people. And this is this is why you can't, you can never comprehensively educate people about Islam through media, because it's all just tit for tat and this and that and this type of thing. You have to have people sit down, take the time, be in a respectful mindset to learn productively, and take them through a comprehensive learning continuum that is structured to have one part build upon another, because that's how good learning takes place. And this medium of professional development and education, this is the place where we can do it in the society in general. And again, it's not a proselytory way of educating it. That's not what the training is, that's not what the book is. It's clinical matter-of-fact education based on the goals of the field itself. You know, it teaches how Islam functions differently. Like this is, you have to teach people at the outset. And this is the difficult thing about trying, people when it comes to public education, they're worried about this issue and that issue and this and this type of thing. And what I say to people with that is you have to find a way to draw people back to some more foundational learning about what it means to be Muslim. Why? Because otherwise, like the conversation is going to be, it's going to be awkward, and it's going to be based on non-Muslims' presuppositions about what it means to have whatever position you have on something. And just a key thing to making non-Muslims understand this, they have to be explained out front that Islam is a text-based religion, because it really differs from Christianity in this way. And people, they always bring their own background experience and their own, they always project their own background experience into any type of new learning they do or any type of conversation they do. So, the way religion currently exists, certainly in America and in the West in general, is everything can kind of be made to be individually subjective. And, what's happened to Christianity over time is at the root of that. Because in Catholicism, and I was raised Catholic, my mother was Catholic, the Pope can change the religion.
Can I have all the girls with me, please, to head over to the art class?
When you're baptized in Catholicism.
Yes, let's go.
And me, when I was a child, we went to the Catholic Church in Burnsville, Minnesota. We didn't go to the one in Apple Valley, Minnesota, the next town. Why? Because I wasn't baptized there. I was baptized by this priest. So it's like you're assigned to that priest, and that priest is kind of your spiritual mentor, if you will. And Protestant Christianity has that same idea very much. You're assigned to a parish, as they will call it, and the reverend is your shepherd. So sometimes people, they overinflate in their minds how much religious leaders themselves can maybe change things or guide people in a certain way. They don't understand the extent to which Islam, it's bound by what texts say. Because there's no body of people, there's no hierarchical organization in the world that gets to decide what Islam is. It's an evidence-based religion. This has to be explained at the outset when you're teaching people about it, because then you can have a conversation differently about anything else. So anyway, just the other thing about it, it gets into how you can introduce perspectives on whatever issue that are rooted in a more religious way of looking at the world into public schools. And that is a perspective that a lot of public education institutions, they might be not open to hearing that from Christians, but they are open to hearing that about us. And also another deep thing the program does is it teaches about how Islamic learning goes and how learning to memorize the Quran goes, which is something that educators need to do because that forms learning habits in our kids that they need to know. And just give me 1 minute before we do the adhan. I'm just going to say, you can refer people to my website, abrahameducation.com, to refer them to the training. But the big thing I recommend for people here, and specifically in Hilliard, and having talked to the school district a little bit and people around here, what I recommend for this community to do is to get my book, and evaluate for yourselves as you like. Form reading groups and invite teachers here to these reading groups. And I can help you pace it out where you read the book a chunk at a time, and you get together with a group of people from the community and a group of teachers, maybe parents with the kid who's teaching their kid right then. You read a chunk of this book every 2 weeks, and you come together. You have enough space at this beautiful masjid that you have. You can host discussion groups and talk about it. We can have guided questions, all that type of stuff. This is actually a really common way that professional development is done in education. And you probably have the resources and the sophistication in this community to run something like that yourselves. So I thank you very much for the time. We will break for the salah, and afterwards, if there's any questions, I'm willing to take them. Wa alaikum.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
استووا استقيموا تراسوا. Straighten your lines, fill the gaps, please. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. تبارك الذي نزل الفرقان على عبده ليكون للعالمين نذيرا الذي له ملك السماوات والأرض ولم يتخذ ولدا ولم يكن له شريك في الملك وخلق كل شيء فقدره تقديرا واتخذوا من دونه آلهة لا يخلقون شيئا وهم يخلقون ولا يملكون لأنفسهم ضرا ولا نفعا ولا يملكون موتا ولا حياة ولا نشورا وقال الذين كفروا إن هذا إلا إفك افتراه وأعانه عليه قوم آخرون فقد جاءوا ظلما وزورا وقالوا أساطير الأولين اكتتبها فهي تملى عليه بكرة وأصيلا قل أنزله الذي يعلم السر في السماوات والأرض إنه كان غفورا رحيما وقالوا ما لهذا الرسول يأكل الطعام ويمشي في الأسواق لولا أنزل عليه ملك فيكون معه نذيرا أو يلقى إليه كنز أو تكون له جنة يأكل منها وقال الظالمون إن تتبعون إلا رجلا مسحورا انظر كيف ضربوا لك الأمثال فضلوا فلا يستطيعون سبيلا. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. تبارك الذي إن شاء جعل لك خيرا من ذلك جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار ويجعل لك قصورا بل كذبوا بالساعة وأعتدنا لمن كذب بالساعة سعيرا إذا رأتهم من مكان بعيد سمعوا لها تغيظا وزفيرا وإذا ألقوا منها مكانا ضيقا مقرنين دعوا هنالك ثبورا لا تدعوا اليوم ثبورا واحدا وادعوا ثبورا كثيرا قل أذلك خير أم جنة الخلد التي وعد المتقون كانت لهم جزاء ومصيرا لهم فيها ما يشاءون خالدين كان على ربك وعدا مسئولا ويوم يحشرهم وما يعبدون من دون الله فيقول أأنتم أضللتم عبادي هؤلاء أم هم ضلوا السبيل قالوا سبحانك ما كان ينبغي لنا أن نتخذ من دونك من أولياء ولكن متعتهم وآباءهم حتى نسوا الذكر وكانوا قوما بورا فقد كذبوكم بما تقولون فما تستطيعون صرفا ولا نصرا ومن يظلم منكم نذقه عذابا كبيرا وما أرسلنا قبلك من المرسلين إلا إنهم ليأكلون الطعام ويمشون في الأسواق وجعلنا بعضكم لبعض فتنة أتصبرون وكان ربك بصيرا الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So quick reminder, inshallah, the program is going on. Ustad Michael Ibrahim is here from Minnesota. And the program started after Maghrib and it's going to continue after Isha. And it's also on Sunday after Dhuhr. The program is all about empowering Muslim students and Muslim parents and how to interface with public schools. So please attend if you can. Right after Sunnah, we'll start the program again, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum. Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're going to start inshallah. So I would request my brothers to come on my left side. And Saad will start right now. Assalamu alaikum.
Hello, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Jazakumullahu khairan to everybody for listening and for being here. And I don't have too much more to say aside from my presentation. I'll just say, number one, on Sunday, I'll be talking again on Sunday. Tomorrow I'm doing an educator training for educators around here. I've got people coming from every district around here. And, some whole departments in some of them. So I'll be doing the training here tomorrow. Then Sunday I will be back. What I'm going to do on Sunday's going to be about parenting skills. Okay, so something I've done in education. I've worked as an instructional coach at an inner city high school for a long time. And you can't survive in that type of work without getting really good at interacting with young people and knowing how to deal with them and this type of stuff. So what I'm going to teach on Sunday is going to be like some really practical skills about interacting with kids that will help you parent a lot. And it's stuff I normally teach to teachers. So it'll be a bit of a different fit in the masjid. Very different audience, but it's stuff you need to know. It's mostly about nonverbal communication. Okay, what you do when kids talk back to you, this type of stuff. Okay, so that's what Sunday will be about. But if anyone has any questions about anything, I'm more than happy to continue talking. And if not, maybe I'll develop some questions for you guys. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With my book, I've had 2 schools in Minneapolis do staff read, not with parents, but they've read it as a staff. Like they've done that form of professional development as a staff. And it always results in changes in practice and this type of thing, and everyone really appreciates it. But if it were a mixed, but a model that is, because again, my work up until this point has been me pestering the public education system. I just reach out to schools constantly and districts constantly and say, here, do this, do that. I get the word out myself completely. So this reaching out about this work that I'm doing to the Muslim community is a new thing for me. So and I think it would be very cool if it were generated by the Muslim community and families here and you hosted it here and that type of thing. I mean, it would be hard for people in the school district to say no to something like that. And I don't think they would say no. They'd be interested in all this type of thing. So again, like, I think it's a really good idea. And I think you can do it here. If you do that, I can develop like a reading guide type thing, pace out the pages. Some pages that maybe you don't need to read or whatever, especially in the beginning, that stuff just going over educational research and this. But I can create like a reading pacing guide for if the group's going to meet every 2 weeks, every month or whatever, you guys can organize amongst yourselves and have and figure out what makes sense. And form some groups. And I think it's a really good idea. And look, the biggest benefit you're going to get from something like that is the kids knowing that you're doing that. Okay? This is something that the kids need to know. They need to know that the parents and the adults in the Muslim community are really taking a strong effort to educate non-Muslims about Islam in a deep way. Because otherwise, what they will get from the actions of adults in the community is that you say Islam is really important, and it's really important in the masjid, it's really important in the home, but if I'm interacting in any type of societal institution or I'm in anywhere that's controlled by the non-Muslims, the effort to externalize my being Muslim and to externalize my Islam, that's kept to a minimum in those places. And I'm not trying to blame anyone, that is the message that a lot of Muslim youth get from the actions of the community at large. And kids learn more from the actions that you do than the words you say. It's completely true, and everyone knows that. And I'm not saying that to, I am at fault with that as well. I do that with my own kids. I'm not saying that to blame anyone, but it's been hard for the community to crack this this problem of, how do we advance people really knowing about our religion more? And I'm a firm believer this is the way to do it. So, there's a grand vision to it. And I know that people, when it comes to parental advocacy, they might think more in these terms of more immediate issues, and you might have more immediate issues going on with your kid in school and this type of stuff, and you can communicate those, but I say don't lose sight of the grander vision, because even when you're talking about these other issues, the educators need to be brought back to that, and the kids need to know that that's going on as well. You could maybe even include some of the kids in the reading and the discussion groups too. Certainly some of the teenagers could handle it. Yeah. Mm.
Because there are no laws against Islamophobia, just like there are laws like anti-Semitism and these laws. We haven't gotten to that point where Muslim Islamophobic machinery has been halted by a law that would stop their churning, their machinery.
Okay.
So in such an environment, how would you envision a Muslim person commanding the respect that they deserve?
Mm-hmm.
They can either assert or, like you said, externalize their identity as they are, and basically, all the other communities, and this is a, pluralistic society, will
Right.
accept the differences as they are
Right.
and respect them for who they are.
Right.
Or they can just keep aligning themselves with the traditions, the psychosocial scene of the prevailing culture.
Right.
And, so if there is Halloween, if there's St. Valentine's, if there is Christmas, we just kind of go with the flow.
Right.
So which is a better model, you think, for a Muslim person to, in the long run, to command the respect that a Muslim does deserve?
Well, look, this is the thing. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize for that. So I'm sorry. The first question was about whether or not the model of a community forming reading groups around my book and partnering with the public school system has ever been done before. The answer is no, but I have had schools who did that on their own. They did that reading, apart from the parents. Second question is about what model is best for a Muslim asserting themselves. Right. Well, I mean, it's a big question. We have to be strategic. I'm trying to be strategic with this. I don't think you can get away from the idea that it involves educating people in a deeper way. Now, like the things you're mentioning about, Halloween, Christmas, or whatever, this type of stuff. I understand that, like non-Muslims, they experience Muslims as getting mixed messages with that type of thing. And then what you see goes on in Muslim communities is the people who, they want to stick more to the more stricter practice, if you want to characterize it that way or whatever, they end up becoming isolated. Because it's like, well, that's not the way that you interact with the society at large, because you have to interact with the society at large on the basis that the society at large is ignorant about Islam. So I just say we have to try to solve that problem for the sake of ourselves and for the sake of our kids. And again, public school educators, they're the place where the interest is there, they have a professional interest, they're conditioned to be open-minded about it, and public school teacher is the most licensed profession in the country. There's 3.4 million licensed public school teachers. A full 1% of the country is a licensed public school teacher. And what they are educated upon sets an agenda for what the rest of society is educated upon. Because the reality is the public education system is where the non-reactionary education happens of the society. Okay, there's the media education that everyone gets. That's all reactionary. But how are people educated when it comes to being educated at length, with structure, in depth, and comprehensively? That's done in the education system. And it's taken place before our very eyes with the racial equity movement of how that has impacted the society's entire perception and discourse about race in the society. Back in the 90s and the early 2000s, and like when Barack Obama was elected, the thinking in the society was we're living like in a post-racial world and we're done talking about race. Like it all got solved in the 1960s. And then you had the African Americans and academics in the institutions there come along and say, no, there's more that you need to know and we need to talk about this. This is the whole theme of how that book, Courageous Conversations, was developed. And now you have it 15, 16 years later, like the whole discourse over race in the society is completely different than it was just 20 years ago because of that. So you can't change things like that, but you can change things over the course of a generation. You've seen that, and I completely believe that. So I hope, does that answer your question as best I can? I understand like thinking about this kind of grander vision, it doesn't necessarily always solve the immediate issues. So sometimes you have to deal with direct issues with the school system in a direct way and say, this is what I want and I don't want my kid involved with this, blah, blah, blah. And in general, schools are willing to make accommodations, has been my experience. You might have to work with them a little bit for that. But I say don't, when you're doing that, don't lose sight of calling people back to a deeper level of learning. Because that is the real issue that is at play, in my opinion. Yeah. Sure. Right. 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 Yeah, so the question is, if in my experience with the public education system, have I experienced people are generally open? And the brother mentioned how his perception based on the media is that, the public school system's gone very left-wing or very liberal and this type of thing. And look, I kind of addressed that in the presentation. Now look, there's activists in the public school system. Okay, there is. The public education system in America is a place where you be active. It is. And sometimes people, it's the case in most of the developing world that the education system is very top-down. You have the Ministry of Education. They write and print all the books for every subject. They bestow those books upon the schools. The teachers teach those books A to Z, and that's what it is, and you're subject to it. That's the way education is in the better part of the developing world, certainly in the Muslim world. American education really is not built upon that. American education is local first. The 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution prevents the federal government from being able to create a national curriculum. So input from families, input from the community, and all that type of stuff, that has always been a part of American education. So there are activists in education here and there, but are they the predominant amount of people? I don't think so. That's not been my experience. And I showed the survey from Robert Slater, or the study from Robert Slater in Louisiana Tech, to show that Again, on average, public school teachers, they are more socially conservative than the average American, on average. Okay, not necessarily on par with maybe us or whatever. And look, if you just think about it, first of all, most people in public education are a little older. The average age of a teacher in the country is 45. Average age of an administrator is 50. So they're a little older. Okay, older people are generally a little more conservative than maybe younger people. And I would say with some of the stuff that people tend to be really worried about these days, it might be the case that a teacher who's more recently gone through teacher education was more exposed to like being directly told, that, you deal with diversity, especially in terms of, let's say, gender and sexuality, this type of thing. That might be the case, But also, too, most people get into education out of an altruistic drive to serve children. So they tend to be people who care about children very much. And a lot of times that is connected to their own religious beliefs. A lot of Christian private schools have some of the most robust teacher training programs. Look at Liberty University. They have the most robust online program. Where I am locally in Minnesota, Bethel University, a Protestant Christian university, they churn out some of the most teachers. People go into those institutions rooted for religious reasons. So so on the whole, I don't experience my colleagues and people in education that way. I experience them as pretty moderate, understanding people, and I really have never came across someone who said that they want to disrespect a kid's parents, and they want to undermine what a kid's parents want. And, in the United States, too, schools are federally mandated, actually, to involve parents in the kids' education. That's written explicitly in the FERPA Act, the Federal Education and Rights Privacy Act. And there's a constitutional right in U.S. case law that goes back to the 1920s for a parent to direct the upbringing and education of their child. So, I generally find that teachers are open. They're very open. They want to work with families. They want to know, a whole other thing about all this diversity stuff in education. And I would say something that people like about my training is, and the nice thing about learning about Islam, when you learn about it, it can really give the teachers some concrete things to grab onto, to do and to not to do, and some boundaries to not go over, and all this type of stuff. And usually I find that teachers find that to be kind of a relief, that there's like a clear criteria. Because I would say a lot of these racial equity, diversity trainings they've done, sometimes they come out of it with nothing more than a whole lot of white guilt. You know what I mean? And they're like, okay, I know these kids are having a different experience than my white upbringing and this type of stuff, but I don't know exactly what that means I'm supposed to do differently in this type of stuff. And a lot of the suggestions that you do find, I'd say they haven't been effective. I get into that a little bit in my book. So, I don't think parents should be afraid of the public school system. I'm not of that opinion at all. Yeah. Yes, sir. That we're having here at Hilliard. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Books that are shown or used. Yeah. Are used in the class. Yeah. Which bear men and women. Right. Right. Or they are used as extra curricular or outside reading. Right. Now, the important thing, in my opinion, I'm a sociologist, and I'm interested in knowing your opinion as an educationist. Yeah. As I heard, okay. Now, what is my opinion? What is the impact of having these two books that are Right.
The impact of these books, whether in the classroom or the books are taken home to their parents
Right.
or whoever is seeing those books.
Yeah.
Could you tell us, please, on the impact
Right.
of such books, whether they are textbooks or if they are shelf books
Yeah.
that can be taken in the library and used by the students?
Yeah.
So here our concern as Muslims,
Yeah.
we want really to be able to express ourselves to the board
Right.
of education
Right.
and tell them our point of view.
Right. Yeah.
And so I would like to have your reaction on
Sure.
this, and perhaps we have
Sure.
more
Yeah. Yeah.
pieces of
Yeah.
textbooks as you see it. Thank you.
Well, as far as the impact on children, do I think it's good for kids to be exposed to that stuff? No, I do not think that's good for kids to be exposed to that stuff. As far as what you can do in the school, I know that this is something that's troubling people. I understand that. And look, from what I know about Hilliard, they do have a policy that you can opt your kid out of those types of things. Meaning you can have it, I believe it's the case, that they have a school board policy that you can have it, if you don't want certain books for them to check out of the library or be exposed to, that you can opt them out of that. And if there's certain things you want them exposed to in the classroom, that you can opt them out of that. Now, it is the case maybe that, and I'm not an expert on like school boards and school board policy. Like my work is really more about like the classroom level of learning. But I do know, I think it's sometimes the case that school boards, they will have a policy like that so that if someone complains, they can say, well, we have a policy, so opt them out. So, if they have that, what I would recommend is trying them on that first. Any parent who has a kid in their school who's concerned about that, let the school know you want to assert your rights and opt them out of that. And the thing is, if you have a group who does that, okay, like one kid opting out might be an awkward situation for the kid because maybe they're just going to be the only one and the school might not be able to do it in a way that doesn't isolate them, and that can be very hard for kids. But if you have 20, 25, 30, 35 parents all saying we don't want our kids exposed to this or whatever, that will likely prompt the school to do something structurally that makes sure that what the parents are asking for is met. And then maybe those books will be put behind a locked box somewhere or something like this. Okay? I'm no fan of those books being in. I understand the sensitivities with that. And that is maybe something that comes alongside the open-mindedness that educators do have. But I do say you can't, the open-mindedness that they do have, I do think it's something that we need to leverage to educate them better. And we can't sacrifice the open-mindedness they have towards us just over sticking to one issue like that. Now look, even with that issue, when you want to talk about those issues with someone who is not familiar with Islam, they don't understand its foundations, they don't understand the intellectual conviction that underrides it, they don't understand the limited individual subjectivity someone can have in interpreting it, they're not going to have a productive conversation with you about it because they're going to project other conversations that they've had with other people who were against that before onto you. And the way they will try to make that conversation will be like, well, can't you just look at it this way? Can't you just look at it that way? Can't you just reinterpret whatever you think? Because that's essentially the conversation that Western society has had with itself. Now, Islam prevents us from buying into that, basically. Alhamdulillah, and that's a good thing. But you won't have a productive conversation with anyone until that foundation is set. And look, if you read my book, I do have a point where I get into issues of gender and the topic of sexual education, and I make it a very explicit recommendation to schools that they need to be very open with parents about whatever the curriculum has, whatever books that they have, and they need to give parents a chance to opt out. But by the time you get to that point when you're doing this learning, the teacher, they've learned everything about each pillar, they've learned everything about each tenet of belief, they've learned things like our eating habits and how you go to the bathroom and all this type of stuff, and they come to understand that with almost every aspect of this religion, when these kids are in school, or when we're in environments that are completely set up by non-Muslims who are ignorant about Islam, we're almost always sacrificing something. We're almost always capitulating something. It's like constant. And when they get a feel for that, then they have bigger empathy for us. And then when it comes to this issue, it'll be like, you know what, you've given in on so much, we're gonna accommodate this because we know how much you've given up of yourselves already. Do you get what I'm saying? This issue, it's like a tipping point issue. Like it's something that rouses people's emotions, so it brings people out. But really, there was like a ton of things that could have been talked about ahead of this. And some of them are more important to the religion. Things that go on in schools. You take the first pillar, violating the first pillar, shirk. There's not uncommon activities that teachers have kids do that entail imitating shirk. Teachers, certainly from kids, teachers, they'll regularly tell kids to do things like knock on wood to hope that something bad doesn't happen in the future. They'll tell them to cross your fingers, and just, these are small things, but they're not small things in our religion, actually. They're not. And if they can appreciate the depth of one of our kids being conditioned into a habit like that, and the psychological depth that it has with us, it just builds empathy with them. So that's just why I say, wherever this comes up, okay, I don't support kids being exposed to sexually explicit things at all. And any parent in the modern world, you have to be very proactive about protecting your kid from that. Not just with school, but with many other things as well. But these issues will always come about in one way or another if you don't go back to this foundational teaching that I'm talking about. Because, even if you can set a policy that removes those books or something, you get the school board to pass it, then the activists in the school system who are mad that got taken away, they'll start talking to the kids about the fact that such and such. Do you get what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? Like you'll never totally avoid it. So, if the school gives you a measure, exercise it. If you have the right to opt kids out, exercise it. If you can do it as a group, even better, because that will likely prompt the school to just practically have to do something structural. But in doing that, don't lose sight of this more foundational education that we need to do with people, because that's what the issue is really about. And we've not done it for too long. And, we're the Muslim immigration wave that came into this country, it's into the second generation now. So they're ready for this. Is that satisfactory? You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's all I can say, And me, and all you have to understand too, I've done a lot of work in public education, okay, a lot. I've exhausted myself trying to teach the public education system about Islam and teachers about Islam. So, to get bogged down in the niche issues, it's a little, it drains me a little bit, you get what I'm saying? Because there's things that need to come up before that, overall. Right.
In a school would be interested. How do we break that to an average family or parents?
Right. Well, this is why I did this presentation today. And, I did do this presentation on the YouTube channel Blog in Theology, which is fairly big a couple weeks ago. So in all honesty, you can send the link you can look it up. It's Empowering Muslim Students in Public Schools, I think, on Blog in Theology. It's a pretty big YouTube channel. People know it. So you can share that with people. Because from my view, we don't have enough Muslim professionals in education because it's not been prioritized as a field of desirable pursuit in Muslim communities generally, especially for brothers. So, which is a problem, correct? It's a problem. So, education is the answer to whatever you're going to ask me. That's why I tried to bring specific items here to show you, it's in the teacher's evaluation rubric that they have to learn about this stuff. The emotional difficulty that comes with trying to break these walls with people, even that they've been conditioned to have broken down a little bit. It is all there right in front of us. So it's just a matter of educating those parents about it. And if you don't think they'll take your word for it, then try to get them to take my word for it. And that's the nice thing about these days. You can just refer people to resources. The other thing too, and why I put the book together and the training, all that type of stuff. It eases the whole thing because it is intimidating to teach people about Islam. Islam itself puts pressure on us to not get it incorrect. So, having preset resources that will lay it out, and it becomes a matter of this is going to structure the learning for us if we're going to do it as a parent-teacher group, or as a parent, I'm just going to refer you to it, that type of thing. All of that lends ease to the learning. And as a teacher, I know, as a teacher, you're constantly trying to get kids to do new things and take on new learning. You have to make it easy for them at the outset. So, that theory underlies all what I'm trying to do here, to try to make it easier for people. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, first of all, what you're saying, you don't lose your First Amendment free speech and freedom of expression rights when you go into a school as a public school teacher. Now, you can't teach doctrine to kids. You can't teach anything as doctrine, but you can, certainly in high school, you can talk to kids about your own personal religious beliefs. And, especially if they're, part of why disseminating my materials in the public education system, there's this emphasis on culturally relevant engagement of kids in the public schools. It's just a reality that sometimes using the type of terminology you are talking about is a matter of culturally relevant engagement to Muslim kids. You're in school, a Muslim kid asks you, how you doing? There's nothing wrong with you saying Alhamdulillah. And because it's a culturally relevant thing to do, and that is known to be good for so many scientific reasons in the public education system, there is what you call a compelling secular purpose to doing it. And this is actually the case with many things that are entailed in our Islamic practice. And that is generally the litmus test, it's called the Lemon test in U.S. case law, over, when it comes to this interface between, governmental institutions and faith-based practices. There has to be a compelling secular purpose for it. And to be honest, public education is overly secular than it needs to be, and it should be. Something we should advocate for, and I read about it in my book, the school should have chaplains. They should hire chaplains. You can have them for the different faiths. The military does that. They're completely government funded. State and federal legislatures do that. They're completely government funded. There's universities and hospitals that are either completely government funded or at least take in significant government funds. They all have religious chaplains for all types of secular good reasons of why there is for them to be there. There's no reason for that those can't be in the schools. They have them in Oklahoma. Oklahoma has them in many schools. So that's just a whole other angle of something that we can have. And kids need that in there. Because it is a dilemma for kids that they're dealing with some sort of issue. You know, a lot of times some type of religious talk is the best thing that they would need. But you have to have the structure set up appropriately for it to do it. And we just need the knowledge ourselves to productively and comprehensively advocate about these things and educate for these things. Hi. Is there any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Her question was about, I apologize. Her question was about Muslim teachers, why there aren't more Muslim teachers, and whether or not it's because you have to secularize yourself when you go into the public school. And she said, like, you know, you can't say Allahu Akbar, this type of thing. And I just pushed back on that a little, like, that's not totally the case. I apologize for not repeating the question. I'm not used to doing that. Yeah. Okay. So. Okay. Right. Yeah, I know. That's the general mode that. Yeah. 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 Well, look. You said you talked to a principal, and the superintendent? Okay. You have kids in the school? Uh-huh. Sure. Yeah. So look, had you had previous meetings with the superintendent? Okay. Now look, that's a little bit of an issue when it's the case that, you know, I'm not saying to not stick up about that issue and to not talk to people about it. But now the superintendent is experiencing you as a Muslim father. How old are your kids in the public school, in the school system? Okay, so you have 2 kids in high school. They've been in school all these years, and you didn't ask to meet the superintendent until this came up. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, there's a missed opportunity there, is all I'm getting at. Now, if that's the issue that brings you out, that's fine, and you can talk to them. But, you know, like you said, that like they won't even have the conversation because there's nowhere for it to move. And that's because we haven't done this more foundational education that needs to be done. And again, I tried to put my resources together so that that conversation can happen in its proper place. Because it does need to happen in its proper place. They need to understand what it means to be Muslim in a more foundational way and in a deeper way before they're really going to be open to having that conversation. Do you get what I'm saying? So I know that's unsatisfying to hear when you feel like it's wrapped up in an immediate concern with your kid in school, who's in school right now. I understand that. But if you take the conversation that way, you can then at least tell your child that you are doing that. And that is impactful. Okay, the kids need to know that we are trying to educate people about Islam. And also, too, like if you're just talking about that, that can have an effect on the kids where they start to feel some sort of way about you being involved in a conflictual way with the people who they have to be around and who are running their schools. And they might just start to just develop an attitude like, oh, Dad, just forget about it. Do you get what I'm saying? And it can backfire in that way. But if it is more about trying to educate people in a deeper way about Islam and advancing the education of Islam in the Western world, which is a noble mission that our kids should be attached to, then your kid will experience that issue in a whole different way. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because it's not just about this and that, it's about something deeper. That's good. Sure. Sure. But look, I get that. And look, I think, like, I wouldn't be talking to you if I didn't really believe my materials that I put together can advance things to a deeper level, no matter what's been done. And I think because of some of the relationship that you were talking about before, and I know Hilliard, I think they were the first district in Ohio to make Eid an official holiday. That's wonderful. So I think that Hilliard is a place where that deeper level can be gotten to. In Minnesota, I have schools where they have 90% Muslim kids, and 10% of the parents are literate. You get what I'm saying? So the type of reading group that I was talking about, not every community out there can do that. If you guys have the capacity to do that, it'd be a beautiful thing. And yeah. Look, right. So look. And what the brother's saying, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to repeat the question or whatever. Our brother here talked about how, in his experience working with kids in the mental health arena, like a lot of the ideas that we're nervous about them picking up, like they're kind of picking it up from a worldview, and the worldview itself needs to be critiqued. Now look, inshallah, it's possible that those types of critiques can be brought into public school classrooms because it's supposed to be a liberal education. And liberal education is supposed to consider all points of views. I understand it doesn't do that, but one of the reasons it doesn't do that is because teachers themselves are not educated on those types of views. And any type of critical analysis, it doesn't come into a classroom unless the person running the classroom knows how to bring it out, basically. Do you get what I'm saying? Now again, I know I keep relating everything back to my book. I hope all of you will take the chance to read it. Like, my book is a step towards that end. Okay, towards bringing critiques of secularism and liberalism, this type of thing, they can be in, those critiques can be in the public school system. They can be. There's nothing that prohibits them. There is a great book written in 2010 by a professor from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill named Warren Nord. It's called Does God Make a Difference? In that book, he makes a very sound argument that the public education system as it exists today actually violates the First Amendment because of its exclusion of religious perspectives in it. So the system itself amounts to a secular indoctrination of kids. Now, that book's not fairly well known about because when he finished publishing it, when he finished writing it, he was stricken with cancer and he died 10 days after he sent it to his publisher. So he wasn't around to promote it. But I suggest people look that book up. I mentioned that book in my book, Does God Make a Difference by Warren Nord. And this is what I'm talking about. Like all these, believe me, I've been dealing with these issues for a long time. You know, all of our dialogue in the Muslim community, I know it all. And, not all stuck for long, I'm not trying to say that, but, I structured the book to really get to that level of depth where we can start talking about that. Also, too, even in that conversation about LGBT kids and, the justifications that it's used behind the type of pro-perspectives that are brought into the public school has to relate to poor physical and mental health outcomes of kids from that community. Now, I have data. There's data out there that suggests that if they were to consider a more religious worldview, they wouldn't have those poor mental health outcomes, and even specifically an Islamic point of view. You can compare, the state of Minnesota does something every 2 years called the Minnesota State Survey. It's one of the few surveys where they'll do in Minnesota, the kids, of course, identify by race, but they'll ask the kids who identify if they're black, whether or not they speak Somali. So it's one of the few data items where you can actually isolate Somali kids in it. And Somali kids are pretty much 100% Muslim. So the largest survey of Muslim of Somali kids ever done was this 2017 Minnesota State Survey. It found that on pretty much the entire array of physical and mental health outcomes, Somali kids have better outcomes than the average Minnesotan kid. And then LGBT kids, they're all the way on the opposite end of the spectrum. They have all these poor outcomes and stuff. Now, the justification, what's always said is LGBT kids have these poor mental health and physical health outcomes because of how their identity is stigmatized and they're an oppressed class. But if you compare them to Somali kids, well, Somali kids, they're black, they're from refugee families, they're low socioeconomic status, they're immigrants, they're Muslim, they have like every factor working against them. They're as oppressed as can be. Donald Trump came to Minnesota and said the presence of Minnesota was a disaster. You can't be more oppressed than they are according to the book. So then the question can be brought, why do these kids have such better mental and physical health outcomes when they are more oppressed than the LGBT kids? It completely destroys that argument. So look, there is a place to have this discourse with people. I understand the want of advancing this discourse with people, but it has to be done productively, comprehensively, and you have to have some things that precede it as well. And this is why again, this is why I put together my materials. Mm-hmm. Right. I understand. But look, I don't really have a lot of people in the public education, like, they're ready to pull those triggers on right-wing Christians because they have a soured relationship with right-wing Christians. But in my experience, they're much more open-minded to Muslims. And again, the way I've laid my learning resources out is only to build their empathy for us and understanding and this type of thing. So I do think, you do have to be careful about how you have this conversation. You do. It's not always safe to just go out and do it. But again, you have these reading groups, you have an enclosed setting, in the safety of the masjid. You can have conditions about the conversations, or like what's in there stays in there, all this type of stuff. You know what I'm saying? That's a way to begin getting to that. You have enough educators go through that experience, you might start to have it be the case where then in the school settings where some of these things are brought up, then maybe some of them start to say, I've been in a lot of talks with our Muslim community, our Muslim family and parents, and they're going through all this and that, and they're not really comfortable. So maybe out front they start considering some of these things. You know what I'm saying? And nothing will change like that. I'm not talking about changing like that. But I ask people to consider the longer view because that's the only way anything happens. Consistency over time. So any other questions? I got to talk for like 6 hours tomorrow, and I'm pretty tired, so I think we're going to wrap it up here, okay? Thank you very much. Anything good that I said came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything wrong that I said came from the evils within myself. And I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship except Allah, and I seek repentance from Him.
इसे बंद कर रहे हैं Assalamu alaikum. I know I hate to disturb you guys, your discussion, conversation. We would like to close the masjid in the next 5 minutes. I'm trying to ask you to leave politely. So we can go to our homes also. Jazakumullah khairan. Let's say next 5 minutes, 9:15. Jazakumullah khairan.